throughout the history of time. Throughout the course of time. And we can see this again, like in the Proclamation of Neutrality, when the French were going into their revolution and making that decision as a nation, whether or not to become involved. We see that the Proclamation of Neutrality was not only widely liked by Americans at the time, but it was also like widely beneficial. So we're seeing that in that situation, the education in schools about the global history for citizens of the United States or people who were growing up and building the United States actually benefited them in once they established those global affairs. Moving into globalization has also been an increasingly key factor since the late 1900s. And extreme poverty has decreased 35% since the 1990s. So what we're seeing is as globalization is becoming, that's across the globe, by the way. And globalization, as it's becoming increasingly more and more influential and impactful on the global stage, it's important that schools across the world are educating students about globalization, about how it's influencing not only their personal lives, but the lives of their country as well. You can't really be teaching national history without covering other countries. So it's important that if a citizen were looking at their education in itself, they can learn about their own country's history while also learning about the global history. And many times they prefer that as it provides them with a far more well-rounded understanding of how their lives are going to be impacted once they enter adulthood and enter the global workforce. Additionally, countries that have history with economic disparity look towards national economic models that are superior. So that is to say, schools like econ majors looking at education as itself in regards to like national financing. We see that when national histories emphasize important things such as capitalism, industrialism, and free market, it can spur trade investment and tech. So we're seeing that the more these things are emphasized and taught in schools about the global level and not just what the nation in itself is doing, we can see that there's more room for innovation for citizens of those nations. So of course they're going to prefer this education where they have far more thoughts and inputs coming in, and they're able to further develop not only their quality of life, but the quality of life of those around them. The Dutch industry of mercantilism during the 17th century directly plays a part in how financial systems operate today. It boosts economies. Boosting economies has led to multiple nations' prosperity. So we're looking at different forms of economic processes that have taken control of the world in the past and applying those to today in order to understand how these past ideas in the world influence nations today, especially because nations in themselves are temporary. Nations rise and fall all the time. So if we're only focusing on the history of that nation, or if we're preferring that history as opposed to global history, we're putting this global history in our back pocket when it's something so critical to not only the development of nations, but how nations will be better in the future. Moving into our second contention, which is about combating ethnocentrism, which is basically viewing other nations as inferior and finding an extremely dangerous form of national interest, and that's being taught in schools. So a lot of times we've seen this leading to discrimination. Example of this is a microcosm in the United States itself of the North and South in the Civil War, whereas in like western parts of the United States, western northern parts, it's referred to as the Civil War, whereas in a lot of southern states, it's called the War of Northern Aggression. So we're seeing by focusing on a microcosm of a region, they're promoting this war that is known as the War of Northern Aggression, which creates in the minds of students this unrealistic understanding of how this war actually took place, and it eventually leads to again the political polarization we're seeing in this country. So if we apply that to the broader scale and see countries doing similar things like that, like for example the Revolutionary War not being called the American Revolution in the United States, it's kind of showing how that centrism in the whichever country it is talking about is limiting the minds and viewpoints and villainizing other countries, when really it's so important right now that states and nations be participating in foreign affairs in a good and healthy way. Additionally, it often uses force or threat to bring about cultural change of certain groups. That is to say, that's about ethnocentrism as a whole, like seeing as this becomes more promoted within a country, as it dials down on the global understanding of history and focuses more on just its national history. More and more with wars that are constantly happening in every nation, we see them becoming villainized, and again promotes this racial and ethnic disagreement and disparity that ultimately leads to negative impact on when it comes to the future of the generations leading out of school and going into the actual workforce. Additionally, national-centric textbooks such as like the British Empire's national history, specifically from Western countries, frame their colonialism as like a civilizing mission, and oftentimes textbooks omit or minimize brutality against other cultures. So this is, again, a way of glorifying a nation as opposed to showing the world perspective in sort of a more objective viewpoint. And we've seen time and time again that history in itself is objective. Things happen. You can't really be making like events and actions that occur something super duper subjective. So it's important that people aren't being forced upon with like this total misunderstanding of how their culture is actually being framed. Additionally, into our third and final contention, which is about the foster of a damaging precedent to citizens of the world and countries. We've seen this like for example, in North Korea, of limiting education, leading to or contributing to the broader scale of oppression of the citizens of these countries, with a true history of a true global centric history affairs would contribute to an overall less oppressive environment, and people will be able to have a greater understanding of their own circumstance and not be so forced into this national mindset and put into like a somewhat robotic state. Nationalism has been used in schools to promote racial and ethnic and religious divisions. We saw this in the rule of Mussolini during the Second World War. As education was restricted to be very nationalist ideas, it ultimately led to a lack of transparency between the government and its citizens, turning education into propaganda, which should not be its intent. And people often don't prefer this as it limits their natural right to knowledge. About John Locke and his view of natural rights, and this is something that humans have innately. And so people do have a natural right to knowledge and to not be attacked by their country by limiting their education and limiting their right to know about how global affairs work. And with that, please cast a government ballot. Thank you.
Amazing. Is there anything else that we need to go over before we get started? I guess I'll say my name's Adrian. I'm obviously going to be the first speaker from side opposition. If anyone's not ready, please let me know. I'd be happy to wait. But if not, I'll get started on my first word. Judges. If all that side government had to do to win this round was get up and say, hey, global cooperation is a good thing, we'd all leave this Zoom room in about 2 minutes. Because obviously, yes, global cooperation is an important thing, and we're not going to contest that on side opposition. Rather, what we're going to say is two things. First of all, while it's important, it's more important that you learn about the national interests that are more proximate to you as a person that you can actually influence more. But second of all, that this is actually counterproductive to global education, that when we learn about global education, it's going to be whitewashed, it's going to be violent, and it's ultimately going to hinder global cooperation. That being said, top of case, no real concerns here, so I'm just going to go straight into op case. Our first contention is on domestic benefits, and we basically tell you, first of all, that education on national identity and on national issues is always going to be more actionable than education on, say, global history, right? A couple of things. First of all, we tell you that learning about the structures that exist in your country and the struggles that have existed to get them to such a point makes you more likely to value these structures, which is to say, when we spend years learning about how, for instance, there's been a long fight to expand rights within the US, we're actually more inclined to value structures that exist to, say, protect them or something like that. And we think that this means that the way you act within your country, which is very immediate, is meaningfully changed. On the other hand, if I spend a lot of time learning about how like people in Kazakhstan spend a lot of time fighting for their rights, like that's nice and all, but it doesn't actually allow me to work towards a better world, right? And we think the reason this is important is because it promotes the existing structures within countries, right? In democracies or countries that are moving towards democracies, it makes people value those, which creates a sense of stability within countries, which is obviously good for the countries themselves, but it's also hard to have a flourishing global order if countries themselves are unstable, right? There's a path dependency here. We also tell you that like issues that have come up in the past in a country are very likely to come up again. For instance, we've seen for a long time how the dynamics in the US between like the North and the South have had a profound impact. You can also think about, for instance, the history of like the Tutsi minority, say in Rwanda. Like you can think of all these examples where there are things that have happened in the past that continue to shape the present and future states of a given country. And that's extremely important for people within that country to be learning, because it's very likely that those things will come up again. On the other hand, learning that like Britain colonized India is like great, but it's like unclear whether that's actually going to come up again, in the world. The second sub-contention here is on cultural awareness and identity, right? We think that like ultimately the history of a lot of countries is going to go neglected if we just care about the global world. Like, for instance, I am Bulgarian. I really love Bulgaria. But if we have an objective history about the world, it's not likely that a lot of time is going to be spent on Bulgaria, because unfortunately, Bulgaria played a very small role in, the development of history, which means that you, as someone who, say, lives in Bulgaria, have a very limited opportunity to actually learn about your heritage. Why is this important? First of all, we think that preserving, say, indigenous history within various countries is just a principled necessity. Like when white people came to America and washed away, say, like Native American heritage, it wasn't only pragmatically bad because like people were sad they weren't connected to their history, but there was also a principled wrong that occurred. And we think that something similar happens because you end up only focusing on these large countries. And I'm going to flesh that out a bit later. We think that finally you have more accountability within a country when there's a focus on its domestic history because it means that there's more effort spent on actually documenting exactly what's happening within that country, right? If you're some small country and now everyone just cares about teaching a global curriculum and it's unlikely your country is going to play a large role, it means that there's no real incentive for, say, historians to spend as much time documenting what's currently going on within your country, which creates a lot less accountability because those in power say, do not have as much of an eye on them. But now the second contention here is on flawed education in global history. First of all, we're going to tell you that like global history is likely massively whitewashed and massively biased towards like European and white people generally. A couple of things here. First of all, as the saying goes, like history is written by the victors, right? Those who have more power are able to shape the narratives within history. And unfortunately, or just like objectively, for most of history, the countries and people with the most power have been like these like North American and European states, right? What does this mean? First of all, the narratives of history are likely to be biased towards them. But second of all, just objectively, the curriculum is likely to be biased towards them. History studies big, powerful historic actors who have had a large influence, right? Like Britain has had more of an influence than Bulgaria is ever going to have. So naturally, the curriculum must focus more on, say, like a Britain or a France than it will on Rwanda or Bulgaria, right? We think that this is bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that it makes people even more detached from their own histories, but it also makes them detached from certain abuses that have happened that people actually need to be present, which is to say, if you're like a developing country and it turns out that like European imperialism has put you in the situation you're in, if you instead spend all your time learning about history from the like winners, the British perspective, you're going to feel less attached to that history. You're going to be less likely to push for corrections to that history. But we also think that global history does not actually prepare us for global interactions, right? They actually hurt global interactions because most of history, most of interactions between different regions of the world in history have been inherently exploitative, right? When the Europeans went to Africa or Asia, the relationship was inherently exploitative. And so when we think that when history just focuses on this, it focuses on a vision of the global order wherein like powerful countries basically just exploit smaller countries, which means that if you're someone who's learning this in like a smaller country, it's unclear what your incentive to interact with like the UN or something like that is when you're learning about how in the past all of these large national power structures have sort of, hurt you. We also think that finally you get a worse depth of study when you just study the global world for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's just hard to go in depth about the entire world. I hope this is pretty clear, but like if you're studying what happens in one country for a year versus what happens in 300 countries for a year, there's just a very physical limitation on how much detail you can get. But second of all, students are much less invested in this kind of learning because it doesn't seem directly applicable to them. It rather seems like it's about, some like far off place they're never going to have to interact with. This matters on two levels. First of all, the purpose of education is to actually teach students things. So we think that like if on our side, education better fulfills its purpose, it's a better system of education. But second of all, there's inherent value in going in depth into history because it shows you that history is more complicated than the simple narratives you get when you just generally talk about history. And this is an important perspective for people to have. But now getting to GovCase, their first point is on globalization. They talk about preparedness for the global workforce. I just don't think this is compelling. Like, first of all, most people just work within their own countries. If you need to interact with people from another country, you can get specific training. But also, like, if I learn about what Kazakhstan has done in history, it's unclear I'm that much more prepared to go and like work in Kazakhstan. Like, there are other ways to solve for this. You can get a specific education for the country you're going to. Then they say that like, oh, it was good that Americans learned what the French did during the American Revolution. If there's a global perspective that's specifically pertinent to your country, that's still going to be covered on either side, right? We tell you that like in the status quo, people mostly learn about their own countries, but we still have a functioning global order, right? The burden here is on the go. On their second point on like combating ethnocentrism, we think that importantly, the biases that they address are still going to be present when we try and teach global history, which is to say that if certain countries have like a paternalistic view of like developing countries or something like that, that's not suddenly going to change because they have to teach them. People are rather going to bring these biases with them. For instance, when you teach the South to cover the Civil War, they're still going to call it the War of Northern Aggression because they have their own biases, right? And then their last contention, when they talk about how this is how, there's certain countries like North Korea that are hugely restrictive and they should learn about other places. Like North Korea is not going to teach you objectively in either world. I don't think this is where the delta in this round is happening. Like if they have to teach about world history, they're going to be like, yeah, world history is like Americans sucking and just exploiting us. Like, I'm sorry, North Korea is not giving you a good, like well-rounded education about the world in either round. I don't think this point has much of an impact. And for all these reasons, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose here.
Okay, I'm Mia Podlick, and I'm the second speaker for the government side of this debate today. For just a brief off-time roadmap, so the judges can flow this easier, I will first kind of be going over a little bit of framework and top of case. I will then be going into my opponent's contentions, and then finally circling back to my contentions and refuting their refutations. If time permits, my time will begin on my first word. Me and my partner still stand on the firmest affirmation of the resolution. This House prefers a global centric to national centric history education in schools. So let's go over topic case. So the first speaker from opposition comes in here and talks about framework. They say, obviously, yes, global cooperation is important, which we call it multiple times in our case. However, they say it's more important to worry about national interest. But let's look at this here, judges. By looking at a global perspective here, we're still taking into account national perspectives, right? But we're drawing on the global experiences of other cultures and other people and impacting, which will directly impact and we can directly draw from into our own national sector, which will directly benefit the people, right? They say that global education is often whitewashed, but however, we're talking about sometimes when they talk about like education being whitewashed, right? We can look directly at our contention too. We talk about ethnocentrism, right? We talk about how we need to avoid this, right? And how becomes a problem because it comes kind of like an echo chamber when people's only national history is repeated to itself, right? We talk about this constantly throughout our case. We can even draw our contention three, right? This talks about strong nationalism in countries such as like North Korea, historical Italy. We talk about all this. When it becomes too much of an echo chamber of the same ideas and the same culture and everything like that, it becomes a mass problem that could then affect the global world negatively. So now let's look at opposition's case. They talk in their contention one about the domestic benefits, right? They talk about they specifically give this idea about if I learn about Kazakhstan's voting rights, it's going to be great. However, we're not really going to be covering Kazakhstan's voting rights. They're kind of minimizing what's really going to be taught on the global level, right? We're talking about global politics, global foreign affairs that are directly going to affect every single person, right? This is what we learn about in world history, right? I took AP World History in my sophomore year of high school. Here I learned about the major impacts and the major events that happen, right? That affect people continuously in the world, even in the present day, right? How are future leaders supposed to ensure mistakes aren't going to be repeated, right? This is why we got to look at other systems throughout the world, right? This is why people who do research and people who are history majors and professors, right? They look at the world as a total, right? To look at what we shouldn't be repeating again. And this is why if something doesn't work in a certain country, right? Maybe you're in the US and something doesn't work out in history and structure and you're just going to try something new. Why not reference other global powers, right? And see what they're doing that is working. They talk about how learning about structures that exist in one's own country leads you to value these structures more because they protect them. But what about if these structures aren't protecting the people, right? Let's look at our contention three. We talked about how Korea, how they're like North Korea specifically, how they're limiting education of true history. And is that structure really benefiting the people? No, I don't think so. They talk about under their contention one how stability is one and one's country is like more important, right? The global state of international relations makes countries rely on other countries for stability, right? People prefer safety, and safety is deeply entwined with the world as a whole, right? If you only focus on your national level, right? We can even look at this now with under Donald Trump's presidency, right? He's really focusing on the national level, right? But this is directly hurting our relationship with other countries. They give an idea, an example of past issues in countries are most likely to occur again, like in Rwanda and US, right? They give those examples, but then they directly contradict this in saying, oh, British India probably won't happen again. So their two contradictory statements don't make any sense. And yes, we're trying to prevent colonialism from British India, right? If we look on the history and see how this was super detrimental, global history, right? Maybe you're not in Britain or you're not in India, right? This is still really important to learn about, and so we can avoid problems like this to happen and to affect people on the national and global scales. That's why their contention one falls flat. Now let's go into their contention two. They talk about cultural awareness and identity, right? They talk about how learning about indigenous histories are important and how we need to like acknowledge the wrong that was done by these countries who were like colonizing, for example. However, I'm going to turn this on its head. The nation of the United States focusing on the history of the United States, it does whitewashing the global history of North America, right? Let's literally look at this, right? we talk about this in our contention two, I believe, which talks about the civilizing mission. We're seeing these national histories are actually whitewashing the curriculum, right? We see that there's banning of books constantly trying to, diminish what wrong a nation has done, right? And so this kind of diminishes the education that people can be receiving, right? Let's talk about we need to fight for change by accounting for this global history, right? People need to know the truth, right? By only focusing on the national level, such as like I mentioned countless times, the U.S. and North Korea, right? They're only focusing on that national history, which is directly not only hurting the citizens of those countries, but also the citizens of the world, right? They talk about under their contention too that more accountability when it's focused on itself. However, accountability is not guaranteed. They give you no evidence or no tangible proof how this is guaranteed at all. By any means, by any means, a national focused education is going to hold everyone on the global scale accountable, right? They talk about how histories and cultures will go neglected, right? The first speaker talks about how, like Bulgarian history, for example, will not be covered. However, in the US, sure, this might be true to some extent, right? We won't prioritize Bulgarian history. Bulgarian history will still be taught in like Bulgaria, for example. We're not ridding someone's own national identity. At least our argument, there's far more higher likelihood of Bulgarian history being taught, right? To these people. It's important that we address all citizens of
You know why?
can I finish my thought real quick?
Yeah.
And if there's a more high likelihood that Bulgarian history can be taught in the U.S., right? Informing citizens, throughout the globe, whether it's not in that nation or not. Yes, I can take your POI.
So if both Bulgaria and America are adopting these like global facing education curriculums, why would there be differences? Why would Bulgaria focus more on Bulgaria?
Well, when you look at global history, right, and you're maybe taking it from the US, well, yes, you're receiving a global history like education and stuff like that. You also still need to learn about your own country, right? You're in your own country. Maybe there's going to be more effects of it, right? That's going to be included in it, right? But here's the thing about it you're still emphasizing the importance, right, and drawing on other histories, and that's how it's going to affect your national one. Now let's go into that's why their contention two falls that. And this is about preference. This is not about like the debate is not exactly exclusive. Now let's look at their contention three. This kind of talks, or it's kind of intertwined with their contention too, and it's more so about education. They talk about how education is insanely flawed and whitewashed. Those who are more powerful, like, will shape the narratives. However, we call this out in our ethnocentrism argument. Countries and national histories are doing the same thing. This is essentially non-unique. Throw that out, judges. They talk about how it hurts global interactions and how relationships will be exploited. However, nationalism and globalization is directly going to be hurt if people are only going to be in this echo chamber of what they're learning, right? There's going to be no alliances that are going to be fostered that are so important that we talk about in our contention one. They talk about how there's going to be a worse depth of history. However, we aren't trying to learn every minuscule detail. This is honestly super irrelevant. Not every minuscule detail is going to be learned in national history. Same thing goes for global history. So drop their contention three. Now let's talk about why our case still stands. Our contention one about globalization. All they say about this is the global effects in your own country will still be taught, right? We bring up the idea of like the proclamation of neutrality. Well, yeah, obviously it's still going to be taught, but we need to look at this on a more global level, right? We need to present things from other countries and give a more diverse outview and more diverse impacts, right? Because we see this constantly through modernization of time. Looking at more diverse viewpoints is directly going to lead to benefit for citizens and benefit for the people. So that's why our contention one still stands. They really touch on none of the stats we give you, and none of the other ideas about the economy, Dutch mercantilism, or anything like that. So those all still stand and flow through. For our contention two, which is combating ethnocentrism, all they say is that biases will still exist. However, is their case giving any solutions to biases when their literal case is built upon biases of one's own nation? They conceded to our definition, which explicitly discusses perspectives and interests which provide the objective component. Let's literally, we can look at this now, right? We talk about history is study past events, particularly human affairs, and our centric definitions talk about emphasizing the perspective, interests, and concerns. So that's why our contention two still stands, and our contention three, which talks about fosters a damaging precedent for citizens of the world and countries. And all they say is that this does not have much of an impact. These are very impactful examples that we give you. This is an example of how the opposition tries to take into extreme, right? If we are going to talk about people's preferences, these environments are not right. We need to see that this is super important. All these examples are really relevant. And finally, for contention one, when they mention about people working in their own countries, working in your own country doesn't limit what you need to know about other countries. Judges, I strongly urge you to cast a government ballot. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. So if everybody's ready, I'm going to assume everyone is. I'm going just for a quick off-time roadmap. My name is Josh Montpeliski, second speaker for the UP. I'm going to be starting with the gov case, then I'll get on to the op case, no topic case to touch on. Okay. With that being said, let me start my time in 3, 2, 1. First thing that we come out of the gate on is on Gov C1, and here you already see a major drop from the Gov in the very first contention, which is they fail to properly address our proximity contention. Regardless of what they tell you, no matter what, there's going to be a greater influence on your life stemming from national policies, national perspectives, than there will be from global history and global perspective. National history is more important to your life. Domestic policies and domestic events are always going to impact you more, as is the case with national history and national development. National history covers the parts of global history that are hyper-relevant to your own nation, i.e. global events that your own nation was involved in. And here's where I really start to touch on this idea that you're being prepared for a global life. We tell you that in the sense that you need to become prepared to interact with the global economy. You're interacting with a global economy from the perspective of America. You trade with France, you trade with the UK from the perspective of an American citizen working for an American company. Why is this important? Because we tell you that when these interactions are actually on the table for your everyday life, they are going to be from the perspective of an American citizen. Therefore, all relevant treaties we have, all relevant trade agreements we have, NAFTA, you learn about it within your own nation's history because your own nation's history includes the relevant parts of that nation's affair in global history. It would be ridiculous for the Gov to come in here and claim that you're not going to learn about World War II when it comes to national history because it's an essential part of America's identity, of America's history. So we think that these really big, really impactful parts of global history are going to be included within your nation's own history and your own history curriculum. But even if you don't buy either of these points, which is either comparatively national history is more important to your everyday life, or B, that the hyper relevant parts of global history are going to be in national history nonetheless, I tell you that either way, this is somewhat of a wash since knowledge of global events is largely irrelevant for 99% of people. Whereas all Americans need to know how to vote and need to know how to interact with the justice system and how the justice system has developed, even lacking knowledge is to their best example, which is we need to know how our economic systems have developed. Even if you don't know where your economic system has developed or how the history of mercantilism has influenced modern day capitalism, I don't see the clear link as to how that's going to affect my everyday life. However, I can very clearly tell you that your everyday life is going to suffer if you don't know how to vote, if you don't know where the Fifth Amendment comes from, if you don't know that you have the right not to testify, right? There's some very important aspects of American history that come into play in your everyday life, whereas you can't say the same even for the most important topics in global history, like mercantilism, like capitalism. Okay. Now onto their C2, which is on combating ethnocentrism. And here's where it's really important to get into what ethnocentrism actually looks like. Ethnocentrism is most promoted by teaching a biased curriculum centered around your own nation. Ethnocentrism, by definition, is comparative. To compare your own nation to other nations and say that your own nation and own perspective is objectively better. Hearing about exclusively domestic American history doesn't make me feel any better or worse about America on a global stage. Knowing that we underwent a civil war, knowing that we had, I don't know, the progressive era, doesn't make me feel any better or worse about America's standing in comparison to Bulgaria. What does change my own perspective on American standing with comparison to other countries is hearing that America is the hero. Hearing about how America saved the Middle East during the early 2000s does promote ethnocentrism. The only way to promote ethnocentrism is to put a spotlight on your own nation with comparison to other nations, and that only happens in a global curriculum. It will never happen in an American history curriculum. Now onto their C3 on fostering damaging precedents to citizens in other nations. And all they really tell you is that North Korea or other authoritarian regimes are going to not teach global history, which means that students there are going to lack this global perspective, i.e. there are students in some nations that don't even know other countries exist and don't even know other economic systems are out there, and therefore those students suffer when they have no ability to gain those perspectives. Well, ultimately, Judge, as we've already told you, and this sounds facetious, but it's true, if you live in a nation where you don't even learn that other nations exist or don't even learn that there are other perspectives out there, you are unlikely to be entirely upended and have your entire perspective influenced by now learning about global history. You don't think the North Korean global history curriculum is going to be skewed? You don't think that other authoritarian regimes are going to carry out very similar biasing? I just don't think that this is a very realistic way to look at it, and we think that their C3 is a large wash. In that if you're not teaching global history in the first place, whatever global history you are to teach is going to be incredibly biased and incredibly skewed and likely going to be a net harm. Now onto the op case. So as far as our first contention, we give you the various domestic benefits to civic engagement to all that. The first thing they try to tell you is to try to actively tell you that your own global involvement is going to be more important than your national involvement. Well, 3 different things. First, they don't actually provide a tangible route as to how this is true. Whereas I can give you like a million examples, such as saying that like we need to know how to vote. We need to know that we have the Fifth Amendment. We need to know why the freedom of speech is important. I can give you like a million examples of how American history is something I use in my everyday life. They literally cannot give you a single example about how the average person uses global history in everyday life. All they tell you is like global historians need to know global history. Like, wow, no way. Like, I think that like if you have to point to like esoteric people who have PhDs in their field as an example of using that knowledge in everyday life, it's probably not knowledge that you need to use in everyday life. Second response is that they don't actually explain how the tangible parts are discussed, how tangible parts are discussed in national history, i.e., like U.S. interactions with other nations, which is the only type of like tangible example they give you. They say, for example, that like you need to know about U.S. trade agreements with France. Well, we know about U.S. trade agreements with France through national history, anyways, because if it's from the perspective of your own nation, if that is the global history in reference, we tell you that simply having more education into national history is going to solve for that. And this is really important, Judge. We tell you that when you are actually valuing national history more, you cover the more relevant parts of national history. And some of that may include, like on the margins, learning more about your own nation's standing with other countries, which is like really important. Now onto the third response here. And this is more touching on like this whole like economic like PhD, like people like PhDs in economics and history majors, etc. All they tell you is like these people use global history and other economic systems in their everyday life. Thus, economics is important. Again, I tell you, if you need to turn to people that are literally getting a master's or PhD in X subject to say that X subject is important to your everyday life, maybe X subject just isn't so important to your everyday life. Now on to the other response I give you to our first contention, which is just like the very fact, the very action of reading history and getting like your own perspective on colonialism can actively battle whitewashing. One, we tell you that like learning about wrongs of a given nation is non-unique, but domestic wrongdoings are more actionable. For example, America has done bad things on both a global stage and a national stage. When I learned about America doing something bad in the Middle East, what am I gonna do? Go post about the Middle East? Like probably not. There's not much action I can really take. On the other hand, when I learn about the history of structural racism in America, another American wrongdoing, there's more action to be taken. So we think that while learning about wrongdoings is to a certain extent non-unique on both sides, when you learn about domestic wrongdoings, you can take more action on them. So cross-apply like our actionable logic here. Second, we tell you, and this is a kind of like a really important probability perspective, which is to say that you are more likely to hear from voices of minority perspectives in national history curricula than you are to hear about voices of minorities in global history curriculum. It is more likely the professor standing in front of me happens to be from a marginalized community within America than it is that Adrian's my history perspective, and I'm so lucky to have a Bulgarian perspective on history, because that's just how probability and American demographics work. You are more likely to have a professor that belongs to a minority community if you're learning about it, if it is a community within your own nation. Really importantly, once again, they drop the proximity claim, like the basic logic that since you are closer to your own national government, since you are closer to your own national events, that's going to be more important. Please follow that through. And now here's where we get to the biggest drop the team makes in the entire round, Judge, and this is what you should be voting on because it's a prerequisite to everything else they tell you. They completely drop the point on investment in learning. Students, including myself, are simply more interested in learning about how it is applied in everyday life. This is a huge prereq to absolutely everything else they tell you, insofar as that if students aren't learning about the various benefits that could derive from global history, then they ultimately aren't going to get any of those benefits no matter what. I tell you that you will always receive all the benefits from national history because students are going to be attentive and interested. So ultimately, their entire case is taken off the ballot because they didn't respond to this huge prereq to everything they say. And then once again, for all of their other responses, I turn you back to like this idea of like comparative ethnocentrism, where it's like you need to have other countries in comparison to your own countries to truly get that ethnocentrism from learning, and that only happens in global history, i.e. national history has like a much more diverse perspective because you have more diverse educators. And with that, I urge a opposition ballot. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wait, okay, amazing. Where's my phone? Oh, did I? Okay, whatever. I'll just use Josh's phone. If anyone isn't ready, please obviously let me know. If not, start my time on my first word. Okay, so basically the way this speech is going to go is going to be pretty simple. First, I'm going to tell you some places where, PMR might get up and talk about these things and why you're just outright not voting on them. Then I'm going to talk about 3 points from our side that were dropped and that all prereq their entire case, so that's an easy ballot for you. But then if you don't buy either of those, I'm going to go into some weighing on some key clashes. So first of all, where are you not voting for them? First of all, they're like third contention, which is this like right to knowledge claim within authoritarian governments. And we tell you that like, look, authoritarian governments are always going to be working really hard to like pervert the information people know so as to maintain their power. And we tell you that like, hey, if North Korea teaches international history, it's probably going to be one that makes the North Korean government actually look good. I don't think we actually get a compelling response here other than like, oh, but they shouldn't be doing that. And like, yeah, people in North Korea shouldn't be just learning about how North Korea is the best, but we ultimately think this is going to happen. We don't have any compelling mechanization inside government on why like North Korea is suddenly going to stop caring about prioritizing North Korean perspectives. But then second of all, when they give you this claim, which is that like, for instance, like an econ major can learn about what other countries are doing with their economies and how that's going to be really good, right? But what does Josh tell you? People who are specializing in specific things are going to learn about those things anyways, right? Someone who's majoring in economics is going to learn about different economic structures anyways, just as how someone who's, majoring in like international politics is going to learn about international politics. Here we're just talking about like the average high schooler who isn't going to be shaping their country's economy. But then, where can you vote for us? These are 3 points that are clean dropped, like there are no responses to them, so you can flow them through and weigh them. Don't let them respond to these points in the next speech. It's going to be new. First of all, investment in learning, right? Sure, maybe us nerdy debaters really love AP World and we think it's really cool. But ultimately, as we tell you in both of the last speeches, the average kid in these countries just doesn't care that much about something that doesn't at all seem applicable to them, to the stories their parents have told them about their country, right? This is a prerequisite to their entire case and should be weighed above it. Because if kids aren't invested in learning the things that Gov is trying to teach them, then they can't get the benefits of kids being taught those things. But then the second thing we tell you is that in response to their case, we say that global perspectives will likely be taught in a very biased way, which is to say that if the South is biased towards itself in teaching the Civil War, it's going to continue being biased even if you force it to teach the Civil War, right? And how do they respond? They say, oh, op doesn't solve. Sure, even if you grant this doesn't change the fact that they still have this problem, right? Like they're conceding that they have the problem. And we tell you that like, why does this matter? First of all, if their claim is, oh, you're going to actually get to know more about other countries and their own experiences, no, you're not if you're teaching in a biased ethnocentric manner. But then we also tell you that it's probably better on our side to not learn that much about these countries at all than to learn actively bad things about them that make them seem like they're actively bad, because that prevents your ability to, in the future, learn better things about them. So you're always going to be weighing this above their impacts because they're also dependent on this. But then finally, we tell you that when you learn about the struggle for the structures that your own country has, when we learn about the struggles for, say, American democracy or that in any other country for that matter, you're more attached to those structures because you know what suffering and what struggle has gone into actually having them, right? This is, and I believe, our first contention. We never get a response. Why are you going to weigh this above any of their claims? We tell you that if people don't value the structures within their own countries, the countries won't be stable. And you can't have a stable global order if individual countries aren't actually stable themselves in the first place. So you're always going to prioritize this over any impacts to the global order. But what impact do they have left? They say that, you're going to be prepared for the workforce. But how do we outweigh this? With our proximity to country, right? We basically tell you that knowledge is useful only insofar as it actually impacts your lives and insofar as you can actually use it to, create a better world, right? We tell you that like when for instance, how the Constitution works or how the US economy works, you can actually use that to make your life better and to address problems within your own country. And so what's the weighing here? Why do you care about this over the whole global workforce point? First of all, 100% of people are going to interact with their own country, and only a subset of people are going to interact with other countries through work or something else. So we're always impacting more people. And we also think that even if a small percentage of your life is dedicated in work, talking to people from other countries, 100% of your life has to do with interacting with structures within your own country. So the probability is always on our side. And for this reason, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose.
Okay, thank you. Before we begin, my name is Una Norbel. I am the first speaker for the government side of this case. This will be the final speech of the round, 5 minutes. I'll just be going over some weighing major points of clash, and then I will be explaining why you should cast a government ballot. My time will begin on my first word. Sorry. We still strongly affirm the resolution that this House prefers a global-centric to national-centric history education in schools, and we continue our weighing mechanism of net benefits that was decided at the beginning of the round and conceded to by the opposition, and we also continue our definition of this House as citizens of the world. One important thing that I do want to point out about this resolution is the fact that it says prefers and not promotes. Preference is something that my team has discussed several times throughout debate, and its relation to the resolution itself and to the citizens of the world, which is what we are evaluating. Whereas the opposition side has many times tried to promote this idea that the government side of this case is trying to argue for exclusive education, one that is limiting the other. But that is, again, not what this debate is about. The debate is about the preference of the people. What are the people preferring, not what will be limiting the people's education or not. Moving into our first contention, which is about globalization and foreign relations, and their discussion that most people work in their countries when you're talking about international relations in terms of trade and economics. But again, as my partner said, working in your own country doesn't limit your need to know about other countries. They talk about how, econ focused majors might find global history useful when looking at the economy, but this does not relate to the fact that international economy is directly related to domestic affairs. They want to talk about how domestic affairs is the most tangible and most important thing to a person in the country. While that may be true, domestic affairs and domestic relations are always consistently being impacted by foreign affairs, especially when it comes to the economy. A country's GDP is almost entirely dependent on its international relations. If people aren't educated about these international relations, how are they supposed to understand why the national things that are happening in their country are happening? This is exactly what my partner was talking about in her second speech. All countries are consistently participating in trade foreign affairs through their alliances and whatnot. So it's important that the citizens prefer to learn about this. They prefer to know what's going on, what's impacting them personally before they can even begin. Again, the prerequisite to knowing about their own nation's history is knowing about other nations' histories. Going into our second contention, which is about combating ethnocentrism, they talk about how the biases that are presented in a national education system will also be presented when talking about global education. But as we discussed, like this is also in reference to our example of North Korea and Italy under Mussolini. They talk about how, this was like such like an extreme, like people would be learning the exact same difference. But the fact of the matter is, these are extreme examples. These are extreme reasons of when this national identity has been over centralized, over focused on, and people are only being educated about that. It goes to these extreme places. That is not something that citizens of the world would prefer. So it becomes up and dangerous every single time. Additionally, they talk about how we are limiting the ability of citizens to learn about their own country. Like they use the example of Bulgaria, but as my partner said very cleverly and very well worded, she said, sorry?
Point of order, sorry, just quickly on the last claim that like when you spend a lot of time just focusing on your national curriculum, that's how you get governments like North Korea or Italy. That seems like a slightly different claim and a new claim from what your original claim here was. Obviously, this is judge's discretion, but it doesn't look on ARFO like you have that specific claim somewhere else.
Okay, that was in our third contention, so it might not be under second contention. I was kind of covering them both in the same, but judge's discretion. Give me a second to gather my thoughts. Okay. My time will begin on my next word. So another point they brought up about their domestic benefits, which I covered earlier, was talking about the what my partner brought up about history majors knowing about global history. This wasn't saying that global history should be limited to history majors. What it's saying is essentially that global history in itself will be emphasized by history majors, obviously, but that doesn't take away from its value to people living within a nation. Although, like in school, for me personally, I would rather learn about how my country is relating in international relations, like how my country is standing like on the pedestal of being a state of the globe, a state of the world, rather than simply like casting a ballot or like that's not stuff that's necessarily taught in school. So it's not necessarily relevant to this debate either. They talk about cultural awareness and identity, which is my point about Bulgaria and how it's becoming so whitewashed and like the United States isn't teaching about Native American history, and they keep bringing this up that the history of like these other places aren't going to be taught. But of course, the United States is not going to teach about Native American history when it's focusing on the history of the United States. It's not prioritizing history before 1492 when Columbus came to the United States. It came to America. It's prioritizing the history of like what is currently happening in that state in itself. So when we're looking at that, we talk about they talk about education restricting stories, as well as how students are more interested in learning about their nation's history. Again, like they told me not to touch on this, but I would just like to say that going back to a point that I made earlier about globalization and foreign relations, which is something I talked about, like the preference in itself and finding interest in learning and education, it's truly weighed in the core of what is relating to the citizen. And as we discussed, the prerequisite to learning about a nation's history is learning about the international history of the country in itself. So going into some weighing, if we look at like the solvency of this, like in the end, and we're talking about what are people actually preferring citizens of the world, are they actually preferring to be under this constricted government where their where their leaders are only teaching them about these ideas and emphasizing their country's abilities and not allowing them to have that international perspective and to have that greater understanding of the globe and its relation to themselves? Or are we talking about the global centric education that's allowing for them to take a step beyond simply what they are trapped in as of now with the national centric relations? And then moving into probability, the probability, if a country is focused on themselves, there's no way for international functionality. They talk about how this is only relevant to people who are in politics, but at the end of the day, it's not true. Every citizen needs to be aware of how their country is functioning on the international scale. So with that, please cast a government ballot. Thank you.
Awesome. Great round, guys. This was lots of fun.
Great round, y'all. We'll come back on camera when we have an RFD.